Have you ever failed at something so many times that you started believing you would never succeed? Maybe it was learning English. Maybe it was school. Maybe it was a dream that seemed too far away. If you've ever felt that way, this story is for you. Because sometimes the person who struggles the most becomes the one who inspires everyone else. My name is Sophie Turner. When I was 16 years old, I hated English class. Not because I hated the language, I hated the feeling. Every Monday morning, our English teacher handed back our test papers. Some students smiled proudly. Some compared their scores with their friends. Then there was me. Every time, I looked at the top of my paper and saw another failing grade. 42, 38, 45, sometimes even lower. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to improve. One afternoon, our teacher, Mrs. Williams, called me after class. "Sophie, may I speak with you for a moment?" I walked to her desk, already expecting another lecture. Instead, she smiled kindly. "I've noticed something." I looked down. "You never stop trying." I was surprised, but I keep failing. She nodded. "Yes, but every time you fail, you ask questions. You rewrite your mistakes. You stay after class. That tells me something." "What?" She smiled. "It tells me you haven't given up." I wanted to believe her, but it was difficult. The next day, our class practiced speaking English in pairs. When it was my turn, I became nervous. The words disappeared from my mind. I forgot simple sentences. I mispronounced easy words. Some students laughed quietly. One boy whispered, "She'll never speak English." I heard every word. My face turned red. That afternoon, I walked home in silence. When I arrived, my grandmother was sitting in the garden, watering her flowers. She smiled as soon as she saw me. "Bad day?" I nodded. I failed another English activity. She invited me to sit beside her. Then she pointed to 2 small plants growing in different pots. "Do you see these?" "Yes." I planted them on the same day. I looked carefully. One plant was tall and green. The other was much smaller. "Why are they different?" I asked. My grandmother smiled. "Because every plant grows at its own speed." She gently touched the smaller one. "Does this little plant have less value?" "No. It simply needs more time." Then she looked into my eyes. "People are the same. Never compare your beginning to someone else's middle." Her words stayed with me all evening. That night, instead of feeling sorry for myself, I opened my English notebook. I looked at every mistake I had made. Then I wrote one sentence at the top of the page. "I will improve one day at a time." The next morning, I woke up 30 minutes earlier than usual. I listened to a short English conversation online. I understood only a few words, but that was okay. The following day, I learned 5 new vocabulary words. The day after that, I practiced introducing myself in English. Some days I felt confident. Other days I felt completely lost. But I made one promise. I would study every single day, even if it was only for 15 minutes. Weeks passed. Slowly, something began to change. I still made mistakes, But I wasn't making the same mistakes anymore. I started recognizing words in songs. I understood simple conversations. For the first time, English didn't feel impossible. Then, one Friday morning, Mrs. Williams announced something that made my heart race. "Next month," she said, "our school will hold an English speech competition. The winner will represent our school at the regional competition." The classroom immediately became excited. Students began talking about the prizes, about the judges, about the audience. Then Mrs. Williams smiled and said, "I hope many of you will participate." I quietly looked down at my notebook. An English speech? In front of hundreds of people? There was no way. As the class ended, Mrs. Williams stopped me again. "Sophie?" "Yes?" "I think you should enter the competition." I almost laughed. "Me?" She nodded. "I believe you're stronger than you think." I shook my head. "I can't even pass most English tests." She smiled gently. Sometimes the biggest victory doesn't belong to the person who starts with the most talent. It belongs to the person who refuses to quit. I walked home thinking about her words. Enter the competition? Or protect myself from another failure? I had no idea. That one decision was about to change my life forever. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the English speech competition. Mrs. Williams believed in me. My grandmother believed in me. But I didn't believe in myself. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. I held my notebook in my hands. I looked at my reflection and whispered, "Good morning, everyone." Then I stopped. It sounded terrible. I sighed and closed my notebook. Maybe this competition isn't for me. Just then, I remembered something my grandmother had once said. You don't become confident before you begin. You become confident because you begin. The next morning, I walked into Mrs. Williams' classroom before school started. She looked up from her desk and smiled. "Sophie, good morning." I took a deep breath. "I've made my decision." She waited quietly. "I want to enter the competition." Her smile grew even bigger. "I was hoping you would say that." Over the next few weeks, we worked together every afternoon. Mrs. Williams didn't ask me to memorize difficult words. She didn't ask me to sound perfect. Instead, she gave me one simple piece of advice. Speak from your heart. If your message is honest, people will listen. So I began writing my speech. It wasn't about becoming famous. It wasn't about winning. It was about never giving up. Every evening, I practiced in front of the mirror. At first, I could barely finish one paragraph. I spoke too quietly. I looked at the floor. I forgot my words. Sometimes I became so frustrated that I wanted to quit. One afternoon, I crumpled my speech and threw it into the trash. "I can't do this," I whispered. At that moment, my little brother Ben walked into my room. He picked up the paper from the trash. "You're giving up?" I looked away. "I'm just not good enough." Ben smiled. "Can I tell you something?" I nodded. "Remember when I learned to ride my bike?" I laughed. "You fell almost every day." "Exactly," he grinned. I didn't stop because I fell. I stopped falling because I kept writing. His words made me smile. Sometimes wisdom comes from the people we least expect. That evening, I picked my speech back up. I smoothed out the paper, and I started practicing again. Every day, I became a little better. Not perfect, just better. Mrs. Williams also taught me something important. Don't try to sound like someone else. Be yourself. She explained that many students focus too much on speaking without mistakes. But communication isn't about perfection, she said. It's about connection. Those words changed the way I practiced. Instead of worrying about every grammar mistake, I focused on sharing my message clearly. Little by little, I began to enjoy speaking. Then came another challenge. 1 week before the competition, we had a practice session in the school auditorium. More than 50 students were sitting in the audience. My hands began to shake. My heart was beating so fast, I thought everyone could hear it. Mrs. Williams smiled at me. "You've got this." I walked onto the stage. The bright lights shined into my eyes. I looked at the audience. For a moment, everything went blank. I couldn't remember the first sentence. The room was completely silent. I wanted to run away. Then I looked toward the back of the room. Mrs. Williams wasn't saying anything. She simply smiled and nodded. I took one deep breath, then another. Finally, I remembered my opening line. "Hello, everyone." My voice was quiet, but it was steady. As I continued speaking, something amazing happened. I stopped thinking about the audience. I stopped thinking about making mistakes. I focused only on my message. When I finished, the room was silent for just a second. Then, everyone applauded. It wasn't the loudest applause. It wasn't the longest. But to me, it sounded like hope. After the practice session, Mrs. Williams walked over to me. "How do you feel?" I smiled. "Nervous." She laughed. "Good." I looked confused. "Why is that good?" "Because it means you care." She paused before adding, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's speaking even when you're afraid." The next few days passed quickly. I practiced every morning before school. I practiced during lunch. I practiced before going to bed. By the time competition day arrived, I wasn't wondering if I could win. I was simply grateful that I had found the courage to stand on a stage. But as I walked into the auditorium that morning, I noticed students from many different schools. Some spoke English almost perfectly. Some had won competitions before. For a moment, the old doubts returned. What if I'm not good enough? What if everyone laughs again? I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded myself of one simple truth. I wasn't the same girl who had failed every English test. I had become someone who refused to stop learning. No matter what happened next, that was already a victory. The auditorium was filled with students, teachers, and parents. There were more than 300 people in the audience. As I looked around the room, my heart started beating faster. The students sitting beside me looked confident. Some were reading their speeches one last time. Others were speaking English with perfect pronunciation. For a moment, I felt small. A voice inside my head whispered, "You don't belong here." Then I remembered my grandmother's words. Every flower blooms in its own time. I smiled. Maybe today wasn't about proving I was the best. Maybe it was about proving that I had changed. One by one, the students walked onto the stage. Each speaker was excellent. The audience applauded after every speech. Soon, it was my turn. The announcer called my name. Sophie Turner. I stood up. My legs felt weak. I took a deep breath and walked toward the stage. The bright lights made it difficult to see the audience. I placed my speech on the podium. For a few seconds, everything was silent. Then I remembered why I was there. I wasn't there to be perfect. I was there to tell my story. I looked at the audience and smiled. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sophie. Today, I want to talk about something many of us are afraid of: failure. The room became very quiet. When I started learning English, I failed almost every test. I believed I wasn't smart enough. I believed English was only for talented people. I almost gave up many times. But then I realized something. Every mistake was teaching me something new. Every difficult day was making me stronger. Success doesn't belong to the person who never fails. It belongs to the person who never stops trying. As I continued speaking, something wonderful happened. My fear disappeared. I wasn't thinking about grammar anymore. I wasn't thinking about pronunciation. I was simply sharing my heart. When I finished, the audience remained silent for a moment. Then, the entire room stood up. Everyone was clapping. Some teachers were smiling. Some parents had tears in their eyes. I looked toward Mrs. Williams. She wasn't clapping the loudest. She was simply smiling. The kind of smile that says, "I knew you could do it." A few minutes later, the judges announced the results. Third place, another student. Second place, a different student. My heart was beating so fast that I could hardly breathe. And first place, the judge paused, goes to Sophie Turner. For a second, I thought I had heard the wrong name. The audience cheered. Mrs. Williams stood up and applauded. My grandmother wiped away a tear. I slowly walked to the stage. As I accepted the trophy, I realized something. The trophy wasn't the greatest prize. The greatest prize was becoming someone who believed in herself. A month later, I represented my school in the regional competition. This time, I didn't win. I finished 4th. Years earlier, that result would have broken my heart. But now, I smiled. Because I understood something important. Winning isn't always finishing in first place. Sometimes, winning means becoming better than the person you were yesterday. Life continued. I graduated from school, I went to university, I continued studying English every single day. Years later, I became an English teacher. On my first day in the classroom, I looked at my students. Some were excited, some were nervous. One girl sat quietly in the back corner. She avoided eye contact. When I handed back the first English test, she had the lowest score in the class. As the other students left, she stayed behind. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm just not good at English." Those words sounded so familiar. I smiled gently. I opened a small drawer in my desk. Inside was my very first English test from high school. The score was 42 out of 100. I handed it to her. She looked at it with surprise. "Is this yours?" I nodded. She looked confused. "But you're an English teacher." I smiled. I wasn't always. Then I told her my story. I told her about the failures, the fear, the laughter, the competition, and the promise I made to myself: never stop learning. When I finished, she smiled for the first time. "So, I still have a chance?" I looked her in the eyes. "You have more than a chance. You have a future. But your future depends on one decision. Don't give up." Years passed. That young girl became one of the best students I ever taught. One day, she sent me a letter. It said, "Dear Mrs. Turner, thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. You taught me more than English. You taught me courage. Now I'm teaching English to children, just like you. I hope one day I can change someone's life the way you changed mine." As I finished reading the letter, I smiled. That was the greatest reward I had ever received. Not a trophy, not a certificate, but knowing that one person's courage had inspired another. And that's how change begins. One person believes, then another, and another. So, if you are learning English today, don't be afraid of mistakes. Don't be embarrassed by your accent. Don't compare yourself with someone who has been learning for years. Everyone begins somewhere. Every expert was once a beginner. Every fluent speaker once struggled to say simple words. The only people who never improve are the people who stop trying. So keep reading, keep listening, keep speaking, keep making mistakes, because every mistake is one step closer to success. Thank you so much for listening. If this story encouraged you, please like this video, share it with a friend who is learning English, and subscribe to Fluent English Hub for more original English stories that inspire and teach at the same time. And always remember, you don't fail when you make a mistake. You fail only when you decide to stop trying.